The morning of March 14th began like any other Tuesday in Seattle. Maya Chen pressed her badge against the glass door of the Pike Place Market Management Office at 7:52 a.m., 8 minutes early, as always. The fishmongers were already calling out their first throws of the day, tourists gathering despite the pewter sky and the smell of rain on cold concrete. Maya liked this hour, the city half awake, its pulse slow and manageable. She was 34 years old, a facilities coordinator who had worked the market for 6 years. She knew every drain, every load-bearing pillar, every leaky pipe in the labyrinthine building that tumbled down the hillside above Puget Sound. She also knew the emergency preparedness binder that sat on the shelf behind her desk, fat with laminated maps and evacuation routes. She had flipped through it dozens of times. She had never once believed she would need it. At 8:04 a.m., the building groaned. It was subtle, a low vibration in the floor, the kind you felt in your chest before you registered it in your ears. Coffee rippled in mugs. Hanging copper pots swayed on their hooks. Maya looked up from her monitor. Around her, a few other early-arriving staff paused mid-motion, heads tilted, faces performing that particular expression of Pacific Northwest wariness. Alert, uncertain, not yet afraid. Seattle shook sometimes. A small tremor, then nothing, then everything. The P wave arrived first, the compressional wave that travels fastest through the earth, a gut punch of pressure that rattled teeth and knocked bottles from shelves. Maya grabbed the edge of her desk, but the P wave was just the herald. 4 seconds later, the S wave hit, and the world came apart. The shaking was nothing like the movies. There was no slow, rolling drama. It was violent and instantaneous and relentless, a rage beneath the ground that seemed personal, as if the earth had decided, specifically and finally, that it was done tolerating what sat upon it. The floor heaved, ceiling tiles cascaded. A window behind Maya exploded inward, and the sound was swallowed by a deeper, more terrible sound. The groaning of a city built on filled land, on ancient glacial sediment, on centuries of human optimism, layered over a geological fault line that had been silent for over 300 years. The Cascadia subduction zone, a 700-mile fracture where the Juan de Fuca plate had been grinding beneath the North American plate for millennia, had finally, catastrophically, let go. Scientists had called it the really big one. They had published papers, held conferences, built models. They had said, with the careful language of people who know the difference between knowing and being believed, that it would be a magnitude 9.0 or greater, that it would shake for 4 to 6 minutes, not the familiar 10 to 30 seconds of the little tremors, and that the shaking alone would be enough to kill thousands. It shook for 4 minutes and 47 seconds. Maya did not count the seconds. She dropped beneath her desk, covered her neck with her hands, and pressed her face against the floor while the building screamed around her. She heard an enormous crash from the main hall, a support beam letting go, and then a chorus of human voices that quickly lost all distinction and became simply the sound of terror, indistinguishable from the building's own disintegration. When it stopped, the silence was wrong. Not true silence. There was moaning and distant car alarms and a hissing she would later identify as a broken gas main 2 blocks away, but the specific silence of a city whose ordinary noise had been deleted. No traffic, no hum of HVAC systems, no steady white noise of a million electric things doing their work. Just the ringing in her ears and the sound of debris settling, and somewhere below, the low, constant lapping of Puget Sound, indifferent and eternal. Maya pulled herself out from beneath the desk. Her hands were bleeding. She didn't know when that had happened. The office was unrecognizable. The shelf that had held the emergency binder had collapsed. She found the binder anyway, half buried under plaster dust, and almost laughed. She went to help. The main hall of Pike Place Market had not collapsed. The old timber frame structure, built in 1907, had flexed, rather than shattered, its century-old Douglas fir beams doing something modern. Steel and glass had not managed on surrounding blocks, but it was grievously wounded. 3 of the stalls near the central arcade had caved inward. The famous fish counter was buried under a section of the upper mezzanine floor. The sign, with the bronze pig, Rachel, had toppled from its pedestal. There were approximately 40 people in the immediate area when Maya emerged from the office wing. Some were on the floor. Some were standing very still, like people in a dream, staring at things that no longer made sense. A woman in a tourist fleece was pressing her hand to a gash on a man's forehead. A fish vendor named Tomas, a big man in his 50s who had worked the market since Maya was in college, was moving through the debris with methodical calm, calling out, checking pulses, his rubber apron covered in blood that was not his. "How bad is it out there?" Maya asked him when he reached her. Tomas looked at her steadily. He had been through the Nisqually quake in 2001. His face said this was not the same. "Bad," he said. "Very bad. The overpass on Western, it's down. I can see it from the north window." Maya absorbed this. The Alaska Way viaduct, or rather its replacement, the surface road and tunnel system that had taken a decade to build, was the main artery between downtown and the waterfront. If Western Avenue was compromised, the waterfront was already cut off from the hill. She was working through the logic of this when she heard the girl. She was maybe 10 years old, standing in the wreckage of a flower stall, holding a bouquet of tulips that was somehow mostly intact, staring at a place in the rubble where a woman's hand was visible, unmoving. The girl's name, Maya would learn, was Priya. She had been visiting Seattle with her mother for a school break. Her mother had stopped to buy flowers. Maya went to Priya and put a hand on her shoulder and gently turned her away. "I've got you," she said. It was not precisely a lie. It was the most honest thing she could manage. They pulled the mother free. She was alive, unconscious, her left arm badly broken. Tomas improvised a splint from curtain rods and zip ties. While they worked, a third person joined them, a young man named Derek, a bicycle courier in a neon yellow jacket who had been caught outside when the shaking started and had run into the market instinctively, seeking cover. He had a long scrape across his jaw and the wide, overbright eyes of someone running on pure adrenaline, but his hands were steady and he was useful. "My bike's outside," he said. "Or what's left of it. The road, there are sinkholes. Big ones. The brick buildings on First, a couple of them just—" He stopped, started again. "There are fires. I can see at least 3 smoke columns from up on Pike." Fires. Maya closed her eyes for 1 second. In a major Cascadia event, the models had always included fire, the gas mains, the downed power lines, the toppled structures that turned the urban grid into a maze of impassable rubble. The fire departments, she knew, would be overwhelmed within the first hour. There would not be enough engines. There would not be enough water. The mains had surely fractured across the city. Seattle would begin to burn, and it would burn for days. She opened her eyes. Priya was watching her. Maya made her face do what it needed to do. "Okay," Maya said. "Let's figure out what we have and what we need. Tomas, do you know where the first aid supplies are kept?" It was Derek who heard it first. He had climbed to the upper level of the market to get a better view of the street grid to the north, looking for a route toward higher ground. The city below was beyond comprehension. He had grown up in Seattle, had ridden every street on his bike, and could not now make the landscape match his memory. The skyline had gaps. One of the towers on 2nd Avenue, he didn't know which one, had shed its curtain wall glass entirely, and the skeleton of the building stood exposed and skeletal against the grey sky. Below the market, the waterfront was chaos. The piers had lurched visibly out of alignment. Pilings snapped like matchsticks. The ferry terminal had partially collapsed into the Sound. He was staring at this when he noticed the water. The Sound had done something wrong. He knew it the way you knew something wrong in a dream. Before you could name it, before it made rational sense. The water had pulled back. Not dramatically, not all at once, but he could see the pilings on the damaged ferry terminal, and he could see that more of them were visible than should have been. The tide line had retreated 20, maybe 30 feet. The exposed mudflats gleamed dark and wet in the grey light. Derek was not a geologist, but he had heard, everyone in Seattle had heard, the thing they said about the really big one. They had heard it at earthquake preparedness talks and on NPR and in the jokes people made when the plates shifted a little and the coffee sloshed. The earthquake, they said, would be followed by something else. He ran back down to Maya. "The water's going out," he said. Maya looked at him. Her face went through something complex and quick, like a door opening and closing. "How far out?" "I don't know, 30 feet, maybe more, and it's still going." The Cascadia subduction zone does not just shake. When a fault of that magnitude slips, it doesn't merely rattle what's above it, it displaces the ocean floor. The seafloor drops catastrophically on the landward side of the fault, and the ocean rushes in to fill the void, then rebounds. The resulting wave, a tsunami, travels at the speed of a commercial jet across the open ocean and slows, compresses, and towers as it approaches shore. Geologists who had studied the sediment layers in coastal marshes had found evidence of Cascadia tsunamis going back thousands of years. In 1700, when the last great rupture occurred, the wave had been documented by Japanese fishermen as an orphan tsunami that arrived without warning. It had killed people along the Pacific coast, from Vancouver Island to Northern California. The wave from a 9.1 magnitude Cascadia rupture, the models said, could reach Seattle in approximately 15 to 30 minutes via the inland passage of Puget Sound, smaller than the open coast waves but still catastrophically destructive. The downtown core, built at sea level, hemmed by the steep slopes of Capitol Hill and Queen Anne and First Hill, had almost nowhere to run. "The emergency binder," Maya said, moving before she finished the sentence. "Evacuation routes. High ground. We need to move, and we need to move right now." She found the binder. She found the page. The designated tsunami evacuation zone for the Pike Place market area identified two primary routes to high ground. Pike Street East toward First Hill, elevation gain approximately 180 feet over a quarter mile, and the stairs to Western Avenue, and then up the hillside paths to the Pike Place hill climb. Western Avenue, Derek had told her, was compromised. "Pike Street," she said. "We go up Pike, now." Priya's mother had regained consciousness. She was pale, clearly in significant pain, but she could walk if supported. Priya took her good arm without being told. Tomas rigged the other side into a support. Derek took point. Maya gathered the handful of other survivors still in the immediate area. 7 more people, including an elderly couple, a man who had been working a coffee stall, and a teenager who had lost her group and could not stop saying the word "Mom" quietly, like a prayer, and they moved toward the door. Outside, Seattle was a different planet. The street in front of the market had heaved into a series of asphalt ridges, each 2 to 3 feet high, cresting and subsiding like a frozen wave. A sewer had erupted through the sidewalk, and dark water was pooling and spreading. On the corner, a brick building from the 1920s had shed its entire facade. The ornate terracotta front wall had peeled away and lay in the street in pieces the size of cars. A man was half buried in the rubble, and other people were already trying to dig him out, and Maya looked at them and then looked at the water far below, which was still retreating, and she made the worst calculation of her life. She couldn't stop. She couldn't save him. She had to save who she had. "Keep moving," she said. Her voice was completely steady. She would be surprised by this for the rest of her life. Pike Street, going up toward First Hill, was a quarter-mile of chaos. The roadway itself was navigable. Barely. The earthquake had buckled the asphalt and cracked the sidewalks into irregular plates, and every 50 feet there was something new to climb over or go around. A collapsed storefront, an overturned vehicle, a tangle of electrical cable draped across the street from a snapped utility pole. The poles themselves had gone like dominoes, some leaning at grotesque angles, some down entirely, live wires sparking in the wet air. Maya kept her group to the center of the street and away from the buildings, whose facades were still shedding glass and debris in the aftershocks. And there were aftershocks, 3 or 4 of them in the first 15 minutes, each one a fresh assault on nerves that were already shredded. Other people were moving with them, a ragged stream of survivors, all understanding the same thing at the same time. Maya didn't know if a warning had gone out. Cell networks were down, phone screens were just error messages, and emergency broadcast banners that cycled endlessly without loading. But the instinct was collective and animal. Up, get away from the water. Halfway up the block, they found the 4th member of their small constellation. She was sitting on the steps of a doorway that had held a woman in her 60s with close-cropped white hair and the kind of calm that comes either from shock or from having survived so many things that this registered as simply another thing. Her name was Rosario, and she had been a public health nurse for 30 years and had retired 2 years ago and now ran a small ceramic studio on Post Alley. She had a compound fracture of her ankle. She had fallen when the earthquake started and had been sitting in the doorway for 20 minutes, watching the city disintegrate, waiting. "I heard people say tsunami," she said, when Maya crouched down to her, not as a question, as a statement of fact, requiring a response in kind. "Yes," Maya said, "we have to get up the hill. Can you—" "I can't walk," Rosario said, "but I can hop, and I've had worse days." She looked at Maya with eyes that had clearly seen many things and decided to trust her. "Give me something to lean on, and let's go." Derek became her support on the left. The teenager, her name was Sienna, she had finally said it when Maya asked, took the right. Rosario hopped and gritted her teeth and did not complain once. They were halfway up Pike when Maya heard the sound. It was low at first, below the threshold of language, more felt than heard. A vibration in the ground, different from the aftershocks, constant rather than spasmodic. Then it rose. She turned and looked back down the hill toward the waterfront, and she saw it. The water had returned. It came from the sound like something waking up, a grey-green wall that had the strange quality of moving both fast and slow, depending on how you looked at it. It was not the Hollywood wave, not the vertical cliff of water from the disaster films. It was something lower and more terrible. A surge, a swell, a relentless press of ocean that simply refused to stop. The demolished ferry terminal disappeared. The waterfront piers disappeared. The surface parking lots at sea level disappeared. The water poured into the streets at the base of the hill and kept coming. And as it hit the structures there, the tourist shops, the restaurants, the parking garages, the sound changed. It became the sound of buildings being broken open like boxes. Maya turned back to the hill. "Run," she said. They ran. Rosario, to her eternal credit, ran. Derek nearly carried her. Priya's mother ran with tears streaming down a face white with pain. The elderly couple ran hand in hand. The coffee stall worker ran. Sienna ran. Maya ran last. And as she ran, she could hear the wave below them, the sound of it climbing the hill, street by street, and she didn't look back again because she didn't need to. She could feel the mathematics of it in her lungs, in her legs, in the burning of her muscles. Close, so close. They reached the crown of First Hill at 9:47 a.m. The wave, when it reached them, was a foot of churning brown water and debris that slid across the flattened summit of the hill and stopped. It was nothing. It was everything. It was the farthest edge of a catastrophe that had swallowed the city below them whole. They stood in that foot of water and breathed. Below, where Seattle had been, there was a sound like the ocean deciding to stay. The water receded over the next 3 hours, pulling back in sullen stages, leaving behind a geography that bore almost no relationship to the city that had existed that morning. From the summit of First Hill, Maya and her group could see the general shape of what had happened. The downtown core, the blocks between the waterfront and approximately 3rd Avenue, had been inundated. Pioneer Square, built on fill-over tidelands, had vanished. The stadiums to the south were visible only by the upper reaches of their facades. The islands of higher ground, Belltown on its slight rise, the hill neighborhoods, were still there, altered but standing, and from them rose columns of smoke from fires that burned unchecked because there was no longer any coherent emergency response system in the city of Seattle. The communications blackout was total. Cell networks were down. Landlines were down. The fiber infrastructure that carried the internet had been severed in dozens of places. What information reached them came in fragments. A man with a hand-crank emergency radio who picked up a FEMA broadcast saying a federal emergency declaration had been made. A woman who had walked down from Capitol Hill and reported that the I-5 ship canal bridges were still standing, but both the 520 and I-90 floating bridges had failed. A paramedic who sat down next to Rosario and between labored breaths said that Harborview Medical Center was operational but overwhelmed, that the hospitals in lower elevations were gone, that there were tens of thousands of injured people and no way to move them. Derek sat with his back against a low retaining wall and stared at his phone, which showed no signal and which he kept checking anyway, the way people do with broken things they desperately want to work. Priya had fallen asleep curled next to her mother, who was awake, gripping her daughter's hand, her face making the private calculations of a parent assessing damage and counting what remained. Tomas had organized the food and water from 3 backpacks pooled among the group and had produced from somewhere a folded emergency blanket, which he wrapped around the elderly woman's shoulders without asking. It was Rosario who said what none of them had said yet. "Help isn't coming," she said quietly. "Not for a while. Not like we're thinking of it." She was propped against a wall, her fractured ankle elevated on a bundle of jackets. Her voice was matter-of-fact, a nurse delivering a diagnosis. The whole coast is this: Oregon, Washington, probably parts of California. They'll be doing airdrops within 24 hours, and FEMA will mobilize, and eventually the National Guard will get here, but the roads in and out of western Washington, look at a map. I-90, destroyed. Highway 2, probably destroyed. Highway 101, the coast. She paused. I drove 101 last summer. You know how much of it is right on the coast? Right at sea level? No one answered. They knew. The whole state is an island right now, Rosario continued. For supplies, for personnel, for everything. The ports are gone. The airports, SeaTac is on the south end, on flat land. I don't know. She looked at her hands. Weeks, maybe longer, before real help gets here in numbers that mean something. They absorbed this. The fires below burned orange against a sky that had gone fully dark by mid-afternoon, partly from cloud cover and partly from smoke. Maya thought about the emergency binder on the shelf that had collapsed. She thought about all the plans, the county plans, the city plans, the FEMA regional plans, the plans that had been updated and revised and presented and stored in binders on shelves in offices that now did not exist. She thought about the fact that the planners had known this was coming. Everyone had known. The knowledge had been public property for decades, and the knowing and the doing were two different countries separated by an ocean of ordinary life, and no one crossed that ocean until the actual water made them. She thought about the man in the rubble on Pike Street. She thought about his hands. She stopped thinking about it. Okay, she said. She stood up. Her knees ached. Her hands were still bandaged with torn cloth from Derek's jacket. Here's what we're going to do. Tomas, you said you know where the Red Cross staging area is supposed to be. The Rainier Community Center was designated a shelter, and it's uphill. It should be there. We're going to get there, and we're going to tell them what we know and what we need, and then we're going to make ourselves useful. Does anyone have a problem with that? No one had a problem with that. Rosario looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone recognizing a particular kind of person. How long have you been in emergency preparedness? She asked. I've never done this before in my life, Maya said. Rosario nodded slowly. No, she said. I suppose none of us have. They moved out in the early afternoon. 7 survivors walking through the ruins of a city that would take a generation to rebuild, if it rebuilt at all in the same form, if the legislature and the insurance companies and the engineers and the grief-stricken citizens could agree on what to build and where, if the young and the mobile didn't simply leave, and the old and the rooted didn't simply give up. Those were questions for later, for years of later, for arguments that would outlast most of the people having them. For now, there was just the walking, and the smoke, and the sound of the sound, finding its new shoreline far inland, and the small column of people moving uphill through the wreckage of the world they had known that morning. The first military supply helicopters reached the high ground of Seattle 17 hours after the earthquake. The first significant ground convoy, coming north from Oregon via inland mountain routes, the coastal highways having been catastrophically destroyed or inundated, arrived 3 weeks and 2 days after the event. The final death toll from the Cascadia rupture, when it was eventually tallied, would be listed in the federal report as an estimate, because census infrastructure had been destroyed along with everything else, and the missing and the dead were tangled together in the mathematics of disaster for a very long time. The estimate was over 40,000 for Washington state alone. The broader regional toll, Oregon, Northern California, coastal British Columbia, was more than double that. Rebuilding took decades. The phrase, the Cascadia generation, entered the language to describe the children who grew up in the temporary housing that persisted in the Cascade foothills for 10 years. New Seattle, when it came, was built 40 feet higher on average, in accordance with new elevation codes that were themselves the subject of fierce political debate for the first 5 years, until no one was willing to debate them anymore. Maya Chen was hired as an emergency management coordinator for King County in the 3rd year after the earthquake. She had no formal credentials for the job. She had a reference from Rosario, who had organized the first coherent medical triage effort in the first hill shelter in the 48 hours after the disaster. She had a reference from Tomas, who had become something of a minor celebrity for the news crews who eventually made it into the city, the fishmonger in the bloody apron who had organized food distribution across 3 square blocks of high ground with the calm efficiency of a man who had been throwing fish every morning for 30 years. She had a reference from Derek, who had taken a job with the Washington State Emergency Management Division and had become specifically the person who planned tsunami evacuation routes for coastal and near-coastal communities. His particular horror, his particular purpose. Priya's mother recovered. Her arm healed imperfectly. She would have a particular gesture for the rest of her life, a way of holding that arm slightly angled that people who met her after never noticed. Priya, who was 14 when she saw her mother's hand in the rubble of the flower stall, was 40 when they finally built the memorial at the new Waterfront. She spoke at the dedication. Sienna found her mother on the 2nd day alive at the first hill shelter. They did not talk about the hours between. Not then, not for several years. And then one day, they did, and then they were done. The Cascadia subduction zone continues to accumulate stress. Geologists say the cycle of great ruptures along that fault can range from 200 to 1,000 years. The 2026 earthquake released significant energy, but not all of it. There are places along the fault, north of the main rupture, where the plates are still locked. This is what the Earth knows that we keep forgetting. It is not done. It is never done. Maya knows this. She has it on a small card pinned above her desk in the King County Emergency Management Office, which sits on high ground, 160 feet above sea level. The card reads, "The question is not whether. The question is only when. And the question after that is, what will you do with the time you have before?"